is the lecture on doing rhetorical criticism in 4 to 6 steps. So why is the chapter 2 called doing rhetorical criticism instead of just rhetorical criticism? Isn't to do like make it sort of redundant? Well, I would argue that no, it's not redundant because it emphasizes the active nature of the word to do, and that rhetorical criticism is that something that you do. It's you are the agent, and the verb to do, rhetorical criticism, is what you are carrying out. So rhetorical criticism is something that you execute, you perform, you accomplish, achieve, finish, and conclude. And another way to put this is that rhetorical criticism is a process that needs to be completed. And because it's a process that, as the lecture title suggests, it happens in 4 to 6 steps, this is a process that takes time and energy. So the 4 to 6 step method for doing rhetorical criticism is taken from the FOSS text. So definitely make sure that you're reviewing the FOSS text and reading chapter 2 in order to keep up with on pace with this class and preparing for the exam too. And then a quote from the introduction of the FOSS chapter 2 text is that this chapter provides the basic instructions for how to do criticism when your starting point is a formal method of criticism. So just to clear up this rhetoric, I wanted to just communicate to you all that in this class, we will be using a formal method of criticism for our starting point. And so you don't have to worry about like, oh, there's this other method for doing it when you're, when there's a different starting point. To make it simple, we will use a formal method of criticism. And so this 4 to 6 step method will be applicable to you all. And some examples of formal methods of rhetorical criticism. So methods that could be used to apply analysis to a text, which we'll get to as the lecture progresses. But just examples of formal methods of rhetorical criticism include cluster criticism, fantasy theme criticism, feminist criticism, genre criticism, ideology criticism, and pentatic criticism. So don't panic that you don't know what these things are. Basically, this FOSS text is structured to have this sort of outline and then to go over these formal types of criticisms. And so just know for now that this 4 to 6 step method is the 4 to 6 step method that we'll be using in this class. And in particular, we'll be using the 4 that are required. So the 4 that are required are the ones that are bolded in this slide: selecting your artifact for analysis, analyzing your artifacts, formulating a research question, and writing your essay. So those are the 4 minimum steps required to get a rhetorical criticism essay done. And step 1 is selecting your artifacts for analysis. And when I was a young communication scholar, when I was coming into communication, and one of my co-workers had told me that in communication we work with artifacts, I was like, that's weird, because my mind initially impulsively went to thinking about digging up artifacts in the ground. And people who are archaeologists dig up artifacts in the ground to find samples of our physical history, or to find physical samples of our physical history that will then reflect something about either nature or society at that time. And so using the metaphor of artifacts that you dig up from the ground, we can think of artifacts as not literal things that we dig up from the ground in order to study, but things that we dig up from the archives in order to study. So artifacts are the data for your study. They're the things that you are looking at. So if you were an archaeologist, you might be looking for bones or weapons or pieces of pottery. And as you go and dig and find these remains, you're digging them up and you're finding remnants of a historical past. Metaphorically, sometimes you're digging up part of a rhetorical past by just going into the archives, which might, just be an internet database of communicative artifacts. And when I say internet database, I mean like it could be a variety of databases that are online. There's not like one internet database of rhetorical artifacts. I'm just saying that rhetorical critics don't dig in the ground. They dig for communicative artifacts, so samples of communication that they can find. And because of our restrictions, because of coronavirus, you all are probably going to be finding these artifacts online this year. So the rhetoric for rhetorical criticism, the data is always going to be rhetoric. And last week's lecture covered, sort of what we conceptualized as rhetoric. So the rhetoric that you want to analyze is the data for rhetorical criticism, and the artifacts are samples of this rhetoric. So you might say you want the rhetoric of a particular campaign, but then what samples are you going to find that sort of are representational or evidence of this rhetoric? So like when you find an artifact in the ground that's a bone, that's a sample of your overall specimen that you, like if you were studying dinosaurs and you found one bone, that's a sample of the dinosaur. It's not necessarily, you don't have to find the whole thing in order to study it. So, and with rhetoric, there's no way for us to study every single communicative act that happened within the sort of rhetorical moment that we're looking at. But we want to find samples or evidence of that rhetoric, or else we don't have anything representative of that rhetoric that we can dig deep and analyze. So some of the examples, some of the types of artifacts that you might find to serve as a representative of the rhetoric that you want to look at would be, for example, political speeches. So this could be YouTube videos, or it could be transcripts of the speeches, or campaign advertisements, or even campaign flyers and that come in the mail, or campaigns that are on TV. Protest signage, so it could be like the signs that people hold up at rallies, or the signs that people hold up at marches, campaign trails, protests. It could even be like the visual rhetoric of the like photography taken at protests. YouTube tutorials, for example, or a variety of, if people have YouTube channels, you could be interested in looking at the rhetoric of YouTube tutorials. And then what type of artifacts would you, if you just searched tutorials into YouTube, you'd obviously get millions of results. So it's like, what artifacts do you want to use in order to represent YouTube tutorial, in order to get a good look at a sampling of the type of rhetoric that is YouTube tutorials. Also, advertisements such as, you might want to look at anti-smoking advertisements, or beauty advertisements, or Trump's tweets, or, another celebrity's tweets, or, tweets that use the hashtag #MeToo. Or specifically, tweets that use the hashtag #MeToo for a specific purpose, like to give a narrative account of something that happened to them, or a narrative account of somebody in power. And then you could also look at newspaper articles, or a specific newspaper. You could look at true crime TV as a genre. You could look at episodes of Friends. You could maybe be interested in the rhetoric of veterans, and you could do interviews with veterans, or maybe you found an archive of interviews with veterans and you want to look at the interview of, veterans and the rhetoric of veterans and their own experiences with war, or their own experiences with social services provided for veterans. You could also look at internal government documents, so like declassified documents. You might be interested in looking at films, the rhetoric of film, particular type of film, particular genre film, particular film, maybe even public art like graffiti or murals. And the options are endless. So just default back to lecture 1. If it's rhetoric, if it's communication that's intended to influence human. If rhetoric is communication created by humans intended to influence other humans, then the realm of communication is basically your oyster in this sense. Like you have endless opportunities of data to sample. It just depends on what you want to study. And your artifacts, according to Foss, must contain the kinds of data that are the focus of the units of analysis of the method. So the reason that I put this quote up here is because it sounds confusing and it's actually simple. And so I just wanted to simplify it for you. And when I say it's actually simple, I mean the wording of this sentence is convoluted, but the point behind it is simple, which is that you want to focus. Like, don't just dig up anything and everything. Like I was saying, if you did a YouTube search for tutorials, you might find a million tutorials. Like, you cannot possibly watch every single YouTube tutorial in order to do a rhetorical criticism of YouTube tutorials. So if you are looking at YouTube tutorials on makeup, then make sure that you're doing that your samples are YouTube tutorials about makeup, not YouTube tutorials about anything, or not books about makeup. So you don't want to just look for anything tangentially related. You want to have a focus, and you want to pick artifacts that represent the type of rhetoric that you want to analyze. So going back to that, the metaphor of dinosaur bones, like if you were a archaeologist and you were doing a dig, then you might find representative samples, you might find pieces of garbage, you might find pieces of pottery, and then you might find one dinosaur bone. That one dinosaur bone is representative sample of the dinosaur. And if you were writing a paper on the dinosaur, you would only, amongst all those things that you picked out, all those artifacts that you picked out of the ground, the only one that you would end up writing about is that dinosaur bone. Like, it wouldn't make it into the report that you also found a bunch of trash when you were digging up and you analyzed that trash and this is what it meant, or you also found some pottery. Like, that, what else was found around there is not relevant to your study, which is on the dinosaur. So if you have focus to your study, then you're looking for those artifacts that specifically represent the thing you want to study. And so this is sort of a call to, when you are looking through your artifacts, come up with a filter for screening out like what artifacts are representative and what ones aren't. So for example, I had done a search in Google about COVID-19 in China. And like, obviously, because COVID-19 pandemic is going on right now, there's just going to be millions of articles that come out if I just search COVID-19 in China. And this search was actually in Google News. And so I went down into the filter and I created a couple extra filters. Like, the website came from NewYorkTimes.com and it was in the past year. So if I'm creating this filter, that probably means that if I'm narrowing it down to NewYorkTimes.com because I want it to be representative of the rhetoric I want to analyze, that means that I've decided to narrow it down to looking at the rhetoric of NewYorkTimes.com and how they focus on COVID-19. Like, because New York Times is such an influential media source, that wouldn't be a bad move to decide to look at one newspaper's coverage instead of trying to say, I want to look at all newspapers' coverage, when that's a process that if you commit to looking at all newspapers coverage, that's going to take like way more time than for a scope of, for example, one class. So think of ways to narrow it down. And another recommendation I have, which is the third bullet point down here, is keeping your method in mind. What does your method call for you to analyze in or about your artifacts? So we'll talk about this a little bit later in step 2 about coding your artifacts. If you keep your method in mind, like, okay, I'm going to do a feminist criticism, or you were keeping your method in mind, I'm going to do a fantasy theme criticism, and then you start to certain artifacts start to pop out to you as, okay, this seems like it intuitively seems like it probably is part of the fantasy. Then keeping your method in mind helps you create these filters ahead of time. And it might mean creating a literal filter like I have showed in image form here. And I'll recommend as well using the Wayne library.wayne.edu and using their filter options, because they actually have a lot more filters that you can play around with than Google News. So it could mean creating a literal filter, but it also could mean just like in your head, sort of having this filter in mind. Like if you search YouTube tutorials and then you start clicking through and watching them, like looking at the introductory, and then you sort of know, like, okay, swipe left, swipe right type of thing. Like this one isn't gonna work, this one is gonna work. That having that filter in your mind about what type of rhetoric you want to analyze, so that when you come across an artifact, you're like, no, this is not the type of rhetoric I wanted to analyze. Swipe left, get rid of it. Create filters that focus on the right kinds of data. All right, so now that we've talked about what are artifacts, they're the things that we dig up for analysis. Now we moved on to step 2, which is actually doing the analysis. So the photo I've chosen here, Lady Gaga with these sort of goggles on, are to show that analyzing your artifacts requires like sort of seeing them through a new light, seeing them through a new lens. And a quote from the Foss text is that this is the step where you engage in a close and systematic analysis of the artifact or artifacts and become thoroughly familiar with the dimensions highlighted by your method. So, you know, you could think of this as reading glasses, putting on glasses that help you to see your artifact better or more closely. But you could also think of them as like these glasses that have a critical lens. So when we talk about critical lenses, we mean that you're actually doing the work to think and analyze critically in order to see something in a different light, in order to see the artifacts in a different light. And in order to do that, you're going to basically become an expert over your artifacts. Like you're going to know more about your artifacts than the average person, or pretty much most people know about your artifacts. You are going to get, you're gonna read them more than once. You're going to go over them, highlight them, mark them up, like pull out sections that you have, there's gonna be parts of the analysis where you write questions for yourself, like, is this the right interpretation? And then you might cross it off, and write a different interpretation. So basically this is the process of getting to know your text, because you can't do the final step of writing and showing that you have findings of a critical analysis if you aren't close to your artifacts. Like if you're going to have an interpretation that people accept as legitimate, you have to be familiar enough with your artifacts that you're confident that you have the right reading on it, or you're confident that you can defend your reading and your view of the artifacts, your interpretation. And this is the step that takes time. So this is not something that it's like, okay, I read my text once, now I understand them. Because if it was just a matter of reading through it one time and then understanding it, there wouldn't be a reason to write an essay about it. It wouldn't be significant enough to do a rhetorical criticism if it was just so obvious what the meaning was. So this is something that takes time, because analyzing your artifacts is something that you're going to want to sit with. As you start to watch and analyze and code, you're also going to create like new filters, and it might even cause you to narrow or hone in on what kind of rhetoric you actually want to study. So like when I said Biden campaign, it's like if you were interested in the Biden campaign and you started looking at it and realized like, wow, the Biden campaign, it's obviously huge, then it's hard for me to look at all these artifacts. But you started by looking at, like, let's say Ohio and then Michigan and then Florida, and Florida really interested in you, then maybe you would decide, I'm going to filter it to just Florida and look at the Biden campaign in Florida. So through the process of analyzing and coding your artifacts, you might decide that your scope of the rhetoric that you want to look at, and thus like the artifacts that would fall under that you're starting to narrow your scope to something that's more controllable, like more manageable, to do this last step of engaging in close and systematic analysis. So in order to analyze your artifacts, you want to code the artifacts using the procedures of your method. And so this depends what your method is, what that means by using the procedures of your method. So that's why it's ambiguous. And I'll give an example in a minute. But one of the recommendations that the FOSS text gave was to get a piece of paper and like write each observation on its own line, and then be able to like sort of like in a bathroom stall where you have like the torn pieces of paper that you can rip off, to have each observation be like torn into a slip of paper so that it can be, and it's on its own little detachable compartment. And I want to echo this, but also give a caveat or give a little bit of a 2020 update, that it sort of shows that the method proposed in this text was written by somebody who like did a lot of their work on pen and paper, which I know a lot of you all these days do your work virtually. But I think that it's an important suggestion conceptually to have independent observations written about artifacts, and have those independent observations be compartmentalizable, like be in different compartments that can be broken up and moved around. If you compartmentalize, you can move those observations around into clusters to start to like visually organize your observations into like more generalizable categories about what's going on with the rhetoric. So you could use strips of paper or note. In my experience, like note cards work better because strips of paper are like flimsy, and if you have multiple strips of paper and you're trying to like move them around, they're harder, like they're just harder to like organize, just having like loose strips of paper everywhere. So like note cards, you can rubber band them, you can put them in a case. Also, they're less likely to just like go flying around in the wind. Or sticky notes. I like sticky notes because you can take the sticky notes and move them around, stick them with each other, like how I was saying, like if it's 3 or 4 uses of a metaphor, or it's 3 or 4 different times that they directly address the audience, then you might want to say like they address the audience at the beginning, they addressed it in the middle, they addressed it in the end. And so now all the times that they address the audience might be on these sticky notes, and I'm gonna put these sticky notes over here, I'm gonna put these other sticky notes on this other it could be a poster board, it could be different pieces of paper that you accumulate the sticky notes, but you have your different observations and you can start to move them around and see patterns. And this also allows you to have the flexibility to start to establish patterns. But if you wanted to, like, for example, if you saw like use of metaphor and you started putting all the sticky notes on a metaphor page, but then you noticed that there was like a lot of day and night or like black and white metaphors going on. And so, but then there was also historical metaphors to another, point in time. And so then you might create a new piece of paper that's like black and white metaphors or, night and day metaphors. And then there might be another piece of paper that says historical analogies or historical metaphors. And then you would take the sticky notes that were the night and day and like move them over. And maybe like by the time you're done with all of your observations, the majority, you realize that there's so heavy use of metaphors that you decide that you want to do like a metaphor analysis. And now you're just observing the metaphors. Another way to do this virtually is just like bullet points or data cells in an Excel spreadsheet, because data cells you can like easily cut or copy and paste around Excel, and you can create like different Excel tabs. And so that would be a way to create like a visual scheme of being able to compartmentalize stuff on Excel. Or if you're not like a visual person and you don't really need to see stuff in front of you or need to see stuff like clustered around each other, you can just think more digitally, then you could just do bullet points in a Word document where you could just copy paste. But again, like bullet point them each observation rather than like typing it into a paragraph form. Like, okay, here's like, let's say you found 5 Friends episodes to fit within your feminist analysis of Friends. And then you are making you're watching these Friends episodes and making observations. By the end of the Friends episodes, all 5 of them, you could have like, 50 to 100 sticky notes, depending on how many observations you make and exactly what you're looking for. But it's nice to be able to shuffle these observations around and sort them by the code. And the code is determined again by the procedures of your method, and we haven't really gotten to the method yet, but depending on what your method is, there will be filters for you to figure out what you need to observe. And so if it was like just write down every single observation you had about any Friends episode, it could be like 1,000 pieces of paper, but if you know, again, like if you know what your method is, if you know that you're looking to do a feminist analysis, you could narrow down your observations to be things that are like relevant to gender. Here's the visual scheme. Let's say I was doing a fantasy theme criticism, which asks for the code of that method, asks for you to analyze the rhetoric and how it fits into the narrative of a fantasy theme. And so what does a fantasy theme require at a base level? It requires a setting, or it could be more than one setting, characters to move the fantasy along, and then actions that those characters take in order to, enact the fantasy. Commencement speech, let's say. And I want to say that the commencement speech given at a graduation ceremony for like a university falls into the fantasy theme. So I'm going to use the text, like start to go deep, do a deeper reading of my text. And I'm going to get out my sticky notes or, if you're on Excel, get out my computer, split the screen so that you have like text on one, your text that you're analyzing on one half, and then your, whatever you're using to record your observations on the other half. And then you're going to start writing out your observations. So like observation 1 and 2, maybe like at the beginning, the scene is starting to be set. And then as you can see over here, like observation 3 is a character, and observation 4, character development. So settings, character development. That would make sense chronologically, like in a fantasy theme, that like your setting would be introduced, and then your characters would be introduced, and then like the actions would come later. So over here, I have observation 2 question mark, like, was that an allusion to an action, or was that just part of settings? Like, I know it was part of settings, but was it also an action? So it's okay when you're writing your observations to put things like question marks, because that's basically you communicating to yourself, like, I'm iffy, revisit that. It may or may not be an action. But we know that the first thing that I observed, like I could say, the setting would be, 2020, the 2020, the American workforce, because if you're giving a commencement speech to people who are graduating, they're going into the workforce, right? And then you have observation 3 and 4, like the characters, you and your classmates, so as you start to say, like, you don't necessarily have to write observation 3, but you might write on a sticky note, like, character equals the audience, character equals the graduating class. And then as the observations continue, you might have made like observation 5, observation 6 didn't even make it on here, right? So let's say you took 20 sticky notes total. There's only 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 10 sticky notes out of here. So maybe I made 20 observations, and then when I'm going to filter them by the code of setting, characters, and actions, I realized that 10 of my observations aren't really data that are supporting what I need to construct this like narrative of the settings, the characters, and the actions, or construct my interpretation about the narrative of settings, characters, and actions that's at play here. So as I go into and keep reading the text, I'm making observations. Like there's another observation that comes up later about settings in observation 7. And then as we go forward, it's like the action really starts to take off. So observation 12, observation 19. These are all observations about things that happen, like what moved the plot along, what actions did the characters take in order to get us into, innovate us, I guess, going along with the fantasy theme, like what can you do as the graduating class to like innovate and move America into its next generation of, success, for example. So the types of actions that it would be possible for you to take as graduate students, would be listed. Those would be observations that you would make about, graduate students who graduated could take actions to make the economy better. Students who have graduated could take actions to make, social services better. Students who are graduating can innovate America into the next level of technological superiority. These types of things about all the great things that graduates can do when they leave here with their degree. So if I wanted to say this, this is where the majority of the action happens, then I would take those sticky notes and then I could arrange them into these 3 sort of components of the code. So the nice thing about this organizational benefit is being able to shuffle these observations and sort them by the code means that I'm not like stuck to the way that the narrative of the speech actually unfolded. So like, as you can see now, it's out of order. Like observation 15 is all the way up here. And this could be because there was like a reference to a really important character part of the way, like half of the way through, but their character was so important that even though these characters were sort of introduced in the beginning, I thought that character, like the 15th observation that I had happened to make was the most important, so I can sort of put it up at the top. And so you're creating basically just a way for you to take data and compartmentalize it and then organize it. If you have these different data points, they should also have sort of they should have some sort of identifying information where you could go back and track them so that you could cite them. So it doesn't have to be like a full citation, but if it's like a page number, or if it's a URL, you know, to a specific YouTube video, make sure to include that, so that, because when you have an observation, it becomes a data point. So like when the scientist says the weight of the dinosaur bone was X, they cite the report, you know, like they cite the report that came from. Same thing with when you all make these observations, you're going to cite the text. So let's say, and so your observations are the data that you can cite in your speech. I mean, in your paper. And then step 3 is formulating your research question, or your art, you know, in the humanities, we'll refer to this as shortened as the RQ. And the research question is getting at what you want to and can find out about rhetoric by studying your artifact. And so the FOSS text says it's what you want to get out of rhetoric by studying your artifact. But I like to add the caveat of what can you find out about rhetoric by studying your artifact, because you've already, like, this is step 3. So you've already selected your artifacts and analyzed your artifacts. So you've already found something out about your artifacts. And now you need to basically figure out what is the connection between my study and rhetoric more broadly. So how can this study help me or help my audience find more out about rhetoric? It's what, after you've done your artifact analysis, what have you found out, and how can that apply to rhetoric more broadly? Like how can we use the findings of your study in order to learn more about rhetoric? What can your study do for understanding rhetoric? So think broadly. Your research question is not about your artifact. It's about rhetoric more broadly. And it forces you to connect your case study to the significance of rhetoric and how it functions more broadly. So it's not just an argument about what's important about your case study, but what your case study shows about what's important about rhetoric. So the research question is a general question, and the answer to that question would apply to your case study, and it would apply to other particular artifacts outside of that study. So this like backwards type thinking is why they recommended doing the Jeopardy method, which is starting with your, you know, answer and then working backwards to find your question. So your artifact should not be in the text of your research question, because your research question should be about rhetoric, and then the artifact should help us understand that thing about rhetoric. But it shouldn't just be a question just about how your artifact is operating. So, like, if you were looking at the Obama campaign and why was the Obama campaign successful? Like, why was the Obama campaign, particularly for hope and change, so successful in the 2000 election, or sorry, the 2004 election? Well, you wouldn't want your research question to be, how did the Obama campaign like affect Obama's affect the outcome for Obama. Basically, like if you made your research question like, how was Obama's campaign successful? That's too specific because it doesn't get to a broader question about rhetoric. But I could frame it like, how do political campaigns influence electoral outcomes? And then I could use the Obama example in order to make a case study for how political campaigns influence electoral outcomes. So think of your case as a case study in rhetoric, and then what is a broader question about rhetoric that your case is like one amongst many cases that fall into rhetoric, you know, the category of rhetoric and rhetorical criticism. But your specific case, what does it help teach us about rhetoric more broadly? So I want to emphasize the Jeopardy method and how important this is, not only in just like that it's a shortcut for you all to do and create your research question, but that you like doing steps 1 and 2 means that you already have the answer to the question. And so the research question step is pretty, it's almost like a part of your analysis because it's like synthesis of your analysis and starting to look at what the conclusions of your analysis are. And this is already starting to look forward to your paper and how you're going to justify like the significance of your study. So using the Jeopardy method means that the analysis that you created in steps 1 and 2 are the answer for your question. So if you have a question that your analysis doesn't allow you to answer, it's a sign that it's not a bad question. It's just not a question that's suited for your study. And that you're gonna end up having to go back and do steps 1 and 2. So it's like in Jeopardy, come up with a new, like how their answer is the question, rather than going back to the drawing board and coming up with a new answer, you need to come up with a new question. Let your observations guide what variables you will use for your research questions. So speech or whatever, or the, what did I say, graduation speech. And you are going to say like, how do political campaigns affect electoral outcomes? Like that doesn't make any sense. Like how does political campaigns affect electoral outcomes would make sense if you were analyzing a political campaign like Obama's campaign. But if you were analyzing a type of rhetoric that wasn't a political campaign, then yeah, you wouldn't have a research question that was like that. Use your findings to discover what is the most significant, useful, or insightful thing about your artifact, and then make that into a research question that corresponds to that discovery. So if I thought that, you know, the Obama campaign was most effective because it used ambiguity around the terms of hope and change, then I might come up with this question, how does an ambiguous artifact persuade? So the observation that would have guided me to come to that research question would have been from looking at Obama's campaign. I would have been like, wow, like people were really persuaded by hope and change, but the ideas of hope and change were very ambiguous. So my observations from step 1 was that my artifact was ambiguous, but it was still really persuasive. So the question of how does an ambiguous artifact persuade is a question that I already have an answer to. And there was a list of research questions on page 11 that I played the Jeopardy game on for you all. So notice that the observations in this section are all specific to the research question, but then the research questions that correspond are all broad, or in other words, generalizable to artifacts that aren't just your artifact. So again, your artifact is a case study that helps you illuminate something about rhetoric. that something about rhetoric is broader. So step 5 is writing the essay, which is creating your finished product, which is a piece of rhetorical criticism. So when we say like doing rhetorical criticism, the final product, like rhetorical criticism, it is a like doing rhetorical criticism is a verb because you are doing the criticism. Like critique, I guess, could also be considered the verb. But it's also like rhetorical criticism is a noun in the sense that the rhetorical criticism is a finished piece of work. It's a well-argued essay that reports your insights. Writing the essay coming in step 5 means that, again, the taking time thing, like you cannot expect to be analyzing your artifacts and choosing your artifacts and analyzing them the same day that you're writing your essay. Like if you haven't organized your thoughts about your observations and sorted them and coded them, then writing your essay is going to be very hard. And on the flip side, the writing the essay is like reporting your findings. So you have to have some findings to report before you start to write your essay. And your findings are the most substantial part of your essay. So if you already like know what your findings are and you already know what your research question is, so you therefore know what's significant about your study and what it says about rhetoric, then it's like you have the major components to write the essay. You just need to actually do the writing. And let your observations and analysis guide your essay organization and construction. So like going back to that fantasy theme one, like the 3 columns, like if you have 3 columns for your code, like settings, characters, and actions, let that be the organizational structure of your essay as well. Like don't overcomplicate it. You've already analyzed and sorted through your artifacts and decided like which observations sort of pair with each other. So if those pairings make sense and are intuitive, keep them clustered together. And reporting your findings, I already said this, it's the bulk of your study, but reporting your findings is like a synthesis of explaining your artifacts to the audience, because we can't like read your mind. You can't just say this is what I found about my artifacts without like explaining and interpreting your artifacts for your audience. You have to cite and explain and interpret those observations for your audience to explain how you came to find what you came to find. And your main task is to, like in a nutshell, your main task is to take what you found when you applied your method to your artifacts and report what you found. So for now, stick to the 4-step method for doing rhetorical criticism, which is selecting the artifacts, analyzing the artifacts, formulating your research question, and writing your essay. And those will be the 4 steps that we will move forward with as we're preparing to write our own rhetorical criticisms.